Hello everyone, my name is Jimmy, and today I am going to be kind of doing another presentation for you guys, something that I consider pretty special to me and my career, and, so just jumping right into it, some of you may know this, but most of you probably will not. I am currently in university. I am an undergraduate majoring in small animal science with a particular focus on herpetology and animal behavior. And one of those things that I've been incorporating into my professional life is the use of bioactive enclosures for keeping these animals, particularly in laboratory situations. I have been somewhat, that's a relatively newer niche of mine. I am studying behavior in general, but for the most part, bioactivity is a big part of the way that I keep these animals, and it's a very important thing for me when it comes to maintaining their proper care. Not saying it's the end-all be-all of reptile care or anything like that, of course not, but I think it has a lot more opportunities than people even let on nowadays, even though it's kind of a big hype thing. And with that, through my university, I was actually able to I got the opportunity to go to an AALAS meeting, which, if you don't know what AALAS is, it's the American Association for Laboratory Animal Science. It's kind of one of the big names in terms of laboratory animal science, essentially. And every year they have a big national meeting. There are sub meetings, which are kind of just through their branches. There's individual branches depending on where you live, and they have their own meetings and their own kind of link ups. But there's a big national meeting run by the president and whoever, and I got the opportunity to go and do a platform session, which is what I'm going to be presenting to you guys today. Not only do I think the information is important, but I also think that, one of the things that I am looking at this from is from the perspective of someone who is a hobbyist. I've been a hobbyist for years, and then transitioning that into my professional life. It's an amazing thing to be able to come home and take care of these animals and learn more about them every single day, but I also want to do a service to them, and I genuinely think that this is a direction which I can do that. So, nothing in this PowerPoint will be groundbreaking necessarily for some people. Hopefully it is for some others. But going from there, I think we should just get started. So, obviously, and for context, obviously presenting this in front of a bunch of people is going to be different than sitting down talking like this. So this won't be a one-for-one recreation of my presentation, because I also had a 15-minute time limit, which also involved questions. So, I'm obviously not going to get the opportunity to, have live questions being asked, but I would actually hugely appreciate if anybody would be able to, if you have any questions, throw them in the comments. One of the biggest things that is important to me when it comes to this topic is making sure I'm not stuck in an echo chamber with my own information, and I can do as much research and I can feel as strongly as I want about this topic, but in the end of the day, what's really important is making sure that we have the truth when it comes to these animals and their care and their, using them in research and everything like that. So any criticisms, any points, anything, I would appreciate if you would comment it. But with that being said, let's get into it. So, bioactivity and its use in captive care and herpetological research. So, what exactly is bioactivity? Well, it's essentially just a colloquial term that's used to describe an enclosure for an animal that can act as its own semi-functioning ecosystem, with the caretaker being Mother Nature, if you will. A lot of the aspects to these enclosures are based on their specific evolutionary adaptations and niches in the wild, and they overall just allow for a more enriching and thought-provoking environment for the animal. They work through essentially, well, okay. The animal itself, the animal in question that you're designing the enclosure for, let's just, I don't know, pick a chameleon gecko. Why not? Let's say you're designing an enclosure for a chameleon gecko and you want to... How do you go about doing that? Well, the idea is that you want that animal in the enclosure to be the driving force for essentially every other decision that you make. These enclosures can be broken down into kind of some categories, so things like tropical or arid. But you're essentially maintaining the artificial ecosystem. And the ecosystem is designed specifically on the animals that you're introducing to that ecosystem. And the system is maintained through a couple of different things. Something that I don't see a lot of people talking about very much is the nitrogen cycle. That's one of the most important things. I know that Snake Discovery has mentioned it in their bioactive setup, adding nitrifying bacteria to their false bottoms, which I think that's brilliant. I've started seeding all of my enclosures with nitrifying bacteria just to get that started quicker. Isopods and springtails are also some of the biggest and most common factors when it comes to bioactive enclosures. There's also different fungi and beetles and millipedes that you can also introduce. But they all drive towards a natural decomposition cycle. Briefly, here are the general layers of a bioactive enclosure. That image was of the first day I'd set up my first bioactive enclosure. But I thought I liked the picture because you can see them very well. You can see the drainage layer at the bottom, a piece of window screen fiberglass mesh as the separation layer. There's the soil, which essentially acts as your filter. I think a good way of looking at bioactive enclosures is just like a fish tank. I honestly think it's that simple. There's no, the biggest difference is there isn't a lot of tests that you can do. Obviously, if you have a water feature, that's one thing, but you can't exactly, dip a stick into your soil and know what the nitrate levels are like you can with an aquarium. So I am looking into like soil testing for bioactive enclosures, or just how to go about doing that in a beneficial way, but that's a different topic. There is then the overlay, which is just the area just above the soil, so it contains things like moss, leaf litter, any other organic material. It's also where waste will fall and dead plants will fall. There is then the showcase layer, which is what people will essentially be looking at, or the main area where the animal might be, depending on which species you're working with. And then the lighting, which will be the way that you replicate sunlight in your enclosure. And I could make an entire presentation on lighting, honestly. That's another big thing of mine that I'm super into. But all of this creates something that I personally like to call the vivarium cycle. Animal waste goes to the floor, the invertebrates and fungi break that down, more bacteria and fungi break down the organics into usable and safe chemicals that the plants can absorb as nutrients to generate new growth, and then that growth either gets, it falls off or it gets trimmed off by the caretaker. And the actual vivarium in question, obviously, is very hyper-specifically functioning based on a lot of the specifications that you have. How much is the system being watered? And / what's the misting schedule? What kind of soil? What kind of plants? What kind of isopods are you using? How bright of a light are you using for your plants? Is it an arid or is it a tropical setup? Is it temperate? Is it like for a corn snake, or is it for an Amazon tree boa? Emerald tree boa. Sorry. So all of these things will change the way that your system both functions and the way that you need to take care of it. So what's the actual difference? So obviously, there's obviously a difference, the way that you maintain it and stuff like that. These are both enclosures for the same animal. The enclosure on the left was an enclosure I had a number of years ago for Nyla, my king snake. And then the enclosure on the right was a in my opinion, the best iteration of her tank. Right now, it's still functioning, but it's not nearly looking as well. I need to get the plants thriving again. But I digress. What's the actual difference in these two types of enclosures in terms of the animal and specifically research? So starting with the animal itself, there's Nyla. As mentioned before, it allows for a lot more of a wider range for environmental stimulation that is, if you set up the enclosure properly, that's based on the animal's natural abilities and the niches that they would take up in the wild. Reptiles are obviously not able to enrich themselves in the same way that mammals do. If you give a snake a ball, they might be kind of interested. They might go up to it and be like, wow, that's weird, or that's kind of cool. They might even sit on top of it, but you don't get as much environmental stimulation from them as you would other animals. And some snakes would just be straight up afraid of it. So how do we ensure that our animals are getting the proper enrichment that they need for captivity? Well, I think the easiest way to do that is in the way that we design their environment. So knowing what these animals' wild habitats are is absolutely needed to understand. Sorry about that. Knowing how these animals interact in the wild is very important for understanding how to take care of them in captivity, and therefore what to provide them with in captivity to naturally enrich them. Microhabitats are also a hugely important thing that not nearly as many people talk about. I do see the word being thrown up more and more, but that's a topic in addition for another time. But microhabitats will also allow for proper enrichment through just being able to have autonomy over their environment. And this also increases confidence and behaviors in their environment that I coined as the school of fish effect. The analogy that goes with this is that, let's say you have a 20-gallon aquarium with a school of neon tetras. Let's say that's your footprint, that those are the parameters you're working with. And you put a single tiny plastic plant directly in the center of that aquarium with a big bright light on top of it. And that's it. You're going to notice that all the neon tetras are going to either hide in a corner, they're going to hide maybe around the plant, they are not going to be fun to look at, they're going to be stressed all the time, and they're going to hide as much as humanly possible because they are very exposed. Whereas if you put in a metric ton of plants, now all of a sudden you see them and they're schooling and they're interacting with their environment and they are thought-provoking to look at. Reptiles work in a very similar way. If you put a snake in an enclosure that is tiny, or not tiny, that's, let's say, too big or too open or without much enrichment, they're going to hide. They're not going to feel confident in their environment. You know, if you put let's say you take that king snake, for example, and you put it in a bin with paper towel and a hide, it's going to hang out. It's going to hang out in the hide more often than not. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. Same thing with fish. I'm sure that there's one neon tetra, which is a little different because they're a schooling animal, so take this analogy as you will. But I'm sure there's that one bold neon tetra that, you know, if you manage to get all the bold ones in a group and put them in that 20-gallon, then yeah, they might eventually, okay, this is my life now. But as a whole, it's not good for the fish. And even if they don't mind it, that's still probably not good for them. So, using leopard geckos as an example, that is a picture of my girlfriend's leopard gecko, who is actually right next to me. Her name is Cersei, and leopard geckos are very rarely given UVB in captivity. I do see that changing, but for the most part, they are not given UVB in captivity because they're considered crepuscular/nocturnal. They're crepuscular, but some people say they're nocturnal. So they tend to they don't give it to them. They give them, they make sure they have proper calcium levels through dietary D3 in their diet. But in addition to just that fact, leopard geckos are shown to have specific regulatory behaviors for their exposure for UVB, particularly by leaving their tail or a single claw or just kind of hanging out near the entrance of a cave to passively absorb UVB throughout the day while they sleep or while they rest. And then when they are comfortable to come out, then they've already absorbed a lot of their UV. So, in addition, a lot of evidence shows that different reptile species will use UVB as actually the primary factor as to where to bask instead of temperature. This concept is actually what I'm designing my research project at my university on. This entire year I've been working on that, and then this coming year I'm also going to be working on it, so maybe I'll talk about that at some point. But the idea is that it seems like an innate concept that reptiles will regulate what they expose themselves to based on temperature, because basking is for thermoregulation, but a lot of studies have shown that, at least in a lot of diurnal lizards and other lizards, that it's actually they prefer UV to regulate their UVB behavior or their basking behavior rather than temperature. So, taking all of these factors into consideration, we know it's a natural behavior for these geckos to regulate their own environment. So, allowing them to have UVB and then designing their enclosure around that concept that allows them to essentially just, regulate it themselves, it allows for both self-regulation of their own dietary needs, meaning there's less of a need for us to do it as keepers. And in addition to that, it provides natural enrichment. Allowing these animals to have autonomy over their environment will allow for natural mental stimulation. In addition, from the research perspective, from the technician perspective, I did talk about how cleanouts are either reduced or potentially not necessary depending on your setup. You don't see many people cleaning out their dart frog vivariums once a month. Like we said, that we're trying to maintain an ecosystem, so therefore, cleaning that out would be a bad thing. And that reduces certain husbandry tasks for technicians if they are maintaining these setups. Decor sanitations would be much more limited. You wouldn't be cleaning plastic plants. And spot cleanings, depending purely on the species, would also be changed. I don't want to say it'll be reduced, but it will be changed. If your crested gecko poops and it falls in the back of an enclosure and the isopods and springtails take care of it in 24 hours, well, there's no need for that. Not the same thing's not going to happen with a king snake, but, I digress. But it does replace these care routines with other ones. So, for example, trimming plants. If you don't have automatic drainage systems, then you might need to manually drain the water from the drainage layer. You might have to conduct more soil and water tests. I also talked about how it can reduce long-term costs because of the reduction in things like cleanouts. From working in a laboratory, bedding is one of the most expensive things that is bought, just because of the amount that's needed. Now, a lot of that is for rodents. Reptiles are a little different, but reptile bedding is also more expensive per cubic inch, so it kind of balances out in a different way. But by not needing to buy that supplies all the time, or being able to reuse products in certain ways depending on your situation through autoclaving and sterilizations that doesn't involve chemicals, all of these are potential outlets for laboratories to be implementing these. In addition, as I mentioned before, it creates animals that are a lot more confident in their environment. That little graph that you can see up there is actually from Dr. Frances Baines, who is a researcher from the UK that has done a lot of research on lighting. I totally recommend looking at her stuff. But in addition to that, because animals in these enclosures are a lot more confident, it allows for better research. So let's use ball pythons as an example. I think nobody is, ignorant of the fact that a lot of ball pythons are kept in racks, they're kept in dark systems, and they are kept in a way that is very difficult for them to exert their natural abilities. As much as people will argue that these dark cubicle drawers are what they would be experiencing in the wild, that could not be further from the truth. I have not seen an ounce of evidence for that. So, the way I think of it is that, even if you're arguing that they're in the dark all the time, it's still not plastic under their feet. Or their feet, they're snakes. I'm going to leave that in just because that was kind of funny. But, they're not sitting in a plastic corner. They either helped manipulate the burrow themselves. They usually take over burrows, but whatever. My point is, these animals are usually under an intense amount of stress because they are just forced to sit there. And that's it. So I would then, let's say you wanted to do research, and that's the specimen that you're working with. Let's say you wanted to do research on basking behaviors. It would be like the equivalent of doing hunting research on a cat that's only been hand-fed every piece of kibble one by one for its entire life. You just aren't going to get good results. There's too much bias from the animal's perspective. If you have a ball python that's never interacted with light or basking behaviors, and its entire thermoregulatory behavior since birth has been based on where in its bin its belly gets warm, it's not going to be a good candidate for whether or not they should be going through basking behavior research. The sentence was kind of got away from me a little bit. Also, real quick, as a side note, if you hear any little weird background noises behind me, I have my dog in the room, and right now she's laying down, but, So, with that said, in addition to that, the models of bioactive enclosures, the research does not necessarily need to be conducted inside of these enclosures. So, for example, just using crested geckos, since I have one on my screen right now, let's say you are doing research on, let's say, their hunting abilities, and you raise them in a bioactive enclosure, and you want to test how long it takes for them to strike at a cricket, purely off the top of my head. You can keep them in these enclosures, move them to an experimental field, and then put them back. People do that with other animals. Let's say you have looking at an analogy with mice, they have their enclosure, and then depending on the research, let's say you're doing behavioral research, you're going to then put them, let's say, in a maze. That's not their home. They don't live there. But for the experiment, that's where they are going to be housed. In addition, obviously, to anybody who's kept to these enclosures, there are cons. They can be very expensive to set up, especially compared to traditional simplistic enclosures. Obviously, long term, they could be cheaper if you do it right, but for the most part, they're considered more expensive. They're also considered non-sterile, so that could be a problem depending on the type of research you're doing. There is a risk of contamination and pests. Some pests are not a big deal, and at the same time also kind of unavoidable. Things like fungus gnats. Even in my laboratory, we have a problem with fungus gnats sometimes, and they're not even bioactive enclosures all the time, so that can be a problem. Some of them can be even worse, like mealybugs. I unfortunately had to completely destroy an enclosure earlier this year because of a mealybug infestation. So that can obviously be a problem and can be therefore become cyclical with being more expensive, because then you have to replace all this stuff. As I mentioned, the cons can vary based on the actual study being done. Again, behavior research, I personally think that these enclosures are ideal for. But if you're doing research that would involve things like surgery, maybe having either 3 types of enclosures, or they're obviously that the actual methods you would go about housing these animals would depend on the study itself and how much stress and their natural behaviors are important for the study. So, to each their own. And some of these downsides can be mitigated through budgeting, proper decontamination before you introduce any new elements to an ecosystem, and just making sure you have, every detail of how you're going to construct it laid out ahead of you. In addition to this, I also talked about public's perspective. So most people, not even most, just a lot of people hear laboratory animal science and they get like an icky feeling in their gut. They feel like it's gross. The idea of using animals for experimentation is kind of niche. And public perspective on laboratory animal science is very finicky. I'm going to say that's the right word. Maybe it's not, but we'll see. So, in addition to that, reptiles are also very commonly feared or hated, or they're disgusting. So these two things do not come together very well. Dogs, cats, and rodents, and a lot of other animals used in laboratory animal science, zebrafish, they all have advocates for them. They all have people who are there to stand next to them, sheep even, and be like, yes, I am here to support these animals, I'm here to support them in research, and I'm here to tell you why they're important. That doesn't really exist with reptiles. I will say, while I was at the meeting, this is not about the presentation itself, but while I was at the meeting as a whole, I didn't really meet many people who were interested in reptiles. They might have had like interest in them, like on a personal level, but there wasn't any like particular, let's say in the exhibit hall, there wasn't a table dedicated to anything to do with reptiles. And if you ask people about reptiles, they're like, yeah, they exist. And obviously that's not their fault. Their focus is on whether it be a product for rats or macaques or mice or zebrafish or even sheep or pigs or dogs. Reptiles are not used nearly as much in research. But I do think the way that people see these animals in captivity, whether it be from a laboratory or even a hobbyist perspective, is important for the way that people treat these animals in the future. So I'm going to give you an example. This is an enclosure that I had designed for a bearded dragon a very long time ago. That's terrible. It's like, from today's perspective, it looks ungodly. The tiny water dish, the single basking area, the slate tile, it's got it all. This screams, beginner in 2015 or whenever I made this enclosure. Now, this won't be a one-for-one comparison, but then I'm going to show you that compared to this enclosure, which you may recognize from my previous video, is for my marbled newt Wilfred. And that enclosure is actually really important to me from a professional standpoint, in my opinion. Kind of a spiritual, professional standpoint, if that makes sense, since this enclosure is what helped me really start to break down everything. But as you can see, this enclosure is just a lot more thought-provoking to look at. And I will say, I do feel that when people come in and they see this enclosure, they understand the keeping of these animals a little better. A lot of people will walk in and they'll especially for newts, let's say, you pull open a drawer and there's a box of dirt and maybe a piece of wood that the newt just happens to be hiding under. And you know what? To each their own. I'm not as educated when it comes to amphibians in that way. Maybe those setups aren't nearly as detrimental to their health as I would say they are for reptiles. I kind of doubt it. I do think that they have a huge benefit from, because I had to keep Wilfred in bins while I was designing this enclosure. If you watched the last video, you'll know why. But I saw the way he acted in both ways, and his behaviors are just so much more complex in this environment. The things he decides to do, the way he climbs, and the way he interacts with everything, I just think is very important to the way that these animals exist. And I think that there is a certain appreciation that people can get by even seeing a really dangerous, scary looking reptile or snake or whatever, and seeing it in this obviously well designed, intricate setup. And I think that there is definitely some benefit in that, in terms of being like, they will walk in and they'll understand. It's like seeing a fish tank. You look at a really pretty fish tank and the fish doing their thing, and you're like, yeah, I get it. A lot of time and effort and research and a lot of things went into that setup. And I think that there is something to say about that for the reptile hobby. There is Wilfred. So my final thoughts on this issue were essentially that, these animals will benefit from these types of enclosures, both from a behavior and from a health perspective, through their ability to manipulate their own environment and the environment being built for their particular needs in the wild. And this fact will then benefit research because it'll essentially prevent biases in research from occurring due to boring or lacking environments, and then animals being raised in these environments and therefore not being able to be studied accordingly on the things that you would want to study them for. And in addition, these enclosures can influence public opinion on these animals if done the wrong or the right way. Public opinion and first impressions matter when it comes to these animals. So, and just in general, to throw it out there, people should be thinking about their animal care. I am sure that anybody watching this will have some criticisms on my views or my care or anything, and that's perfectly fine. I actually almost hope that there is. The overall goal that I have with people and their care is to just think about it. People get into the habit of, oh, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And my snake is alive, or my dog is alive, or well, maybe not 40 years, but you know what I mean? They've been keeping bettas in bowls with a lucky bamboo plant sticking out of the top, and they've had 40 bettas for 40 years, and they all live 2 years. And that's it. That there's no more thoughts that go into it. Growing up, I was told that filters killed fish because a family member of mine would see them in the filters at pet stores and would, correlation doesn't equal causation in that circumstance. And there's no harm, or I'm not hating on that opinion, or not that opinion, on that view, but it's from not being educated. And obviously I'm in a unique situation because I am dedicating my entire life to these animals, which includes fish as well. I'm more of a herp guy, but when it comes, I also thoroughly enjoy keeping fish. I have one right now. I have a betta named Wilson. Actually, me and my girlfriend are co-parenting Wilson. But these things are propagated a lot in society, in terms of how these animals should be cared for, and people get stuck in routines. And the fact of the matter is, these animals need proper environmental stimulation just like anything else, and we really just need to be thinking about the way that we're taking care of our animals and to strive to continuously do better at it. Nobody is good enough for, or nobody's too good for criticism, is what I'm trying to say. There's always ways to improve. So that's pretty much it. I will thank you for watching this video. I hope that this presentation or this discussion was interesting in general. For the next video, not entirely sure what's going to happen, or what I'm going to do it on. I have some new additions that I am definitely going to be talking about, so there are projects coming up in the future that I'm going to be working on. But for now, thank you for watching this presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or criticisms, please put them in the comments below. I am thoroughly enjoying answering all questions that are brought to me, especially when it comes to their care or anything in general. Any comments. You can tell me I suck, and that's fine. So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely evening, or day, or just look at the clock, look at the closest clock to you, and I hope the time that you're reading is a good time for you right now.